Everyone.
So next up we have Hannah Ferguson. Hannah recently completed an MA in theology at Regis College in Toronto. She is currently receiving a THM at the School of Theology and Ministry at Boston College. Her interests include political theology, as well as the theologies of Johann Baptist Metz and Hans von Balthasar. Today, Hannah is going to be speaking on Pope Francis's culture of encounter as psychic conversion against the globalization of indifference. Hannah, you can unmute yourself and take it away.
Thank you. All right. Since the first days of his papacy, Pope Francis has identified and continued to return in both speech and action to the problem of the globalization of indifference, as he calls it, as one of the fundamental issues, if not the paradigmatic issue of our day. This claim suggests that indifference, that is, the failure to be moved by another human being, whether in joy or in horror, is the current key challenge for our church. Echoing the statement repeatedly made by Lonergan that our present crisis is not a crisis of faith, but one of culture, Francis points to the normalization of horrors and distortion of beauty in capitalist and utilitarian societies as the source of our inability to be moved affectively, and so to act accordingly in response. This indifference with which we meet so many who suffer is fundamentally opposed to love. It is simultaneously a denial of the loving response meant for another human being, and a refusal to see the truth, to recognize a tragedy in its reality. Francis identifies this as the great sickness of our time, one brought in through the capitalist economies that teach us to treat everything in the mode of getting and spending, and regard others as means for self-satisfaction. The document produced by the bishops of Salem at Aparecida, for which Francis was a key contributor, states, "Advertising creates the illusion of distant make-believe worlds, where every desire can be satisfied by products. The notion that desire should turn into happiness is condoned. This notion creates a virus that paralyzes, rendering us lethargic and insensitive, a disease that eats away at the heart of religious fervor, giving rise to a new and deeply sad paganism, the paganism of indifference." Gradually, Francis says, as we continue in these ways, almost imperceptibly, we grow incapable of feeling compassion for others and for their problems. We have no interest in caring for them, as if their troubles were their own responsibility and none of our business. And far too often, those who most need a gentle sign of love receive instead the deafening silence of indifference, the selfishness of those annoyed at being pestered, the coldness of those who silence their cry for help with the same ease with which television channels are changed. And so one spirals in the self-absorption that frees one from any sense of responsibility, and so also peace. Peace with oneself, with one's neighbor, with one's environment, and with God. Our future is in living together, but we cannot begin to work that out without being responsive to our neighbors. How can we become weavers of community and artisans of peace, bringing dialogue and creating the conditions for relationships? How can we free ourselves from our deafness to God's appeal to our consciences and the cry of suffering? It is overcome only by movements of the soul, by concrete spiritual responses that open what is closed and turn our hearts of stone to God's love that desires to share this love with our brothers and sisters. Overcoming indifference is essential for any real possibility of genuine love, for transforming evil into good, for any real commitment to bringing about the kingdom of God. When we let our consciences be deadened, we cannot see beyond our own horizon and become apathetic to others, contrary to the message we are given. Christ's model tells us that God never grows unconcerned. The law of the cross not only calls each of us to relationship with Christ, but also the capacity to enter into relationship with others. The gospel proposes the divine charity welling up in the heart of Christ and generating a pursuit of justice that is at once a hymn of fraternity and of solidarity, an impetus to the culture of encounter. As a failure to respond properly to another human being, indifference lies not primarily at the intellectual level, as a matter of understanding, nor at the moral level as a failure of judgment, nor even at the level of one's orientation to God, yet it makes claims on each of these levels and bears significant consequences in the way one lives and acts in the world. or more likely fails to. Rather, indifference stands at the level of the subject's psyche, where the imaginative and affective dimensions of one's consciousness should be held in tension with one's unrestricted desire to know. That is to say, that the images and affects arising in the sensitive psyche inspire the sort of spontaneous intersubjective concern by which one finds oneself reaching out to catch a falling child. Indifference takes hold, however, by breaking that tension, when one makes a habit of ignoring this instinct that commands one's full attention. When the sensitive psyche cannot connect with the desire to know and to love, when an image or a feeling is repressed, the unrestricted desire is greeted with apathy rather than the loving personal concern demanded and stops short of a fully human response. We learn to ignore those faraway tragedies as numbers, irrelevant and unknown. We learn to repress those images and feelings that summon us to action, to care for fellow human beings, and make demands on our attention and responsibilities. We learn to leave them unknown in order to get on with our lives. Indifference filters out those emerging feelings that offer a way out, that signal to us our failure. Thus, when this tension fractures and the image does not arise in our psyche, we become unable to respond in feelings to the consonance or dissonance between the values we hold and their fulfillment or breakdown and rejection in society. Responding properly to another human being requires the sort of transformation that occurs in what Robert Doran calls psychic conversion. Doran describes this as the establishment or re-establishment of, quote, a link that should never have been broken, the link between the intentional operations of understanding, judgment, and decision, and the tidal movement that begins before consciousness, emerges into consciousness in the form of dream images and affects, and continues to permeate intentional operations in the form of feelings and reaches beyond these operations and states, and the interpersonal relations and commitments that constitute families, communities, and religions. End quote. Properly done, psychic conversion is the transformation of the sensor, which sorts the data of our experience and filters out that which is irrelevant so that we receive the right images, the transformation of this faculty from a repressive to a constructive role in a person's development. In this case in particular, then, it is a transformation of the sensor that encounters the suffering of others, not only as relevant, but as decisive for one's own living and acting in the world, and one's personal relationship with God. In this way, Francis has made the key project of his papacy meeting the problem of the globalization of indifference with what he calls a culture of encounter, through the use of images and stories that bring to mind the priority of God's love, that prepares our hearts and minds for bringing about the kingdom of God. This theology emphasizes loving personal concern, that views the stranger as a neighbor experienced as a gift of being invited into the bonds of communal relationship. This emphasis on entering the narrative and dwelling with the image of another opens the subject to the reality as seen through the eyes of the suffering. The gesture or narrative offered by Francis supplies the image previously repressed or filtered out in association with a situation as both a counterexample to one's own insufficient response and a model for proper human concern. As an image, it evokes the appropriate feelings that should supply the desire to know with a deep and personal alarm. One of the key conditions for creating a culture of encounter is that we make room in our hearts. We purge ourselves of the distractions and excuses we often allow to take over. These distractions deaden our consciousnesses from what is truly important and convince us that things do not look that serious, and that the planet could continue as it is for some time. This is the way human beings contrive to feed their self-destructive vices, trying not to see them, trying not to acknowledge them, delaying the important decisions and pretending that nothing will happen. This attitude, fostered by a culture of indifference, stifles our feelings that naturally arise in response to values being rejected and ignored, and enable us to continue on in our comfort without any acknowledgement of our responsibility to our neighbors. When one is invited into an encounter by love, one grows in faith and knowledge of God in a new way which grants the eyes with which that person lives, revealing in what went previously unseen the beauty and value or the horror and disvalue around them. Or when we live out of a spirituality of drawing near to others and seeking their welfare, our hearts are open wide to the Lord's greatest and most beautiful gifts. Whenever we encounter another person in love, we learn something new about God. As such, Francis consistently works on our psyche's imaginative and affective dimension with stories and images, particularly his own gestures, which place us in a new horizon. In modeling different levels of empathy in these gestures, Francis provides the image that the sensitive psyche previously filtered out, offering a counterexample to the subject's indifference in the face of suffering and model of empathy and loving personal concern. These examples, which starkly contrast our own lack of concern, call attention to our own failures in the proper response. In this way, Francis's culture of encounter, which prioritizes the sort of loving personal concern that radically transcends the spontaneous intersubjective mutual aid among humans, works to restore our fleshy hearts and open our ears in order to make genuine Christian love among neighbors a reality. Thus, when we experience psychic conversion, we experience again the gift of the eyes of love, the same mind that was in Christ Jesus. When Jesus speaks to people, he does so with personal love and concern. And moved by his model, we seek to share fully in the lives of all, listening to their concerns, helping them materially and spiritually in their needs, rejoicing with those who rejoice, weeping with those who weep, arm in arm with others. We are committed to building a new world, but we do not do so from a sense of obligation, not as a burdensome duty, but as the result of a personal decision which brings us joy and gives meaning to our lives. When we are touched by this experience of God's love, which heals the dramatic bias by which we filter out those images that bring people close and maintain the bonds of community, we overcome the problem of indifference that tempt us to keep suffering at a distance. These images and gestures of affection, which Francis underscores as decisive, express the concreteness and closeness that call upon our responsibility to one another. Only in being moved by love are we able to touch human misery, to touch the suffering flesh of others, which complicate our lives in amazing and unexpected ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Great exploration of that concept of how are we overcoming this paganism of indifference and connecting it with this culture of encounter and psychic conversion. Thank you. Are there any questions for Hannah right off the bat? Let's see, Michael, go ahead and unmute yourself if you can.
There I am. Thanks for this, Hannah. That was great. I'm wondering about the category of indifference, as Francis names it, and how it might be similar to the sin of acedia, and what that similarity or difference means for the conversion that's needed in that culture of encounter. I mean, are our souls on the line if we don't get over this indifference for Francis, or is it just sort of a psychic thing that we wallow in?
Geez, that's a tough one. Acedia seems like it's a hard, I guess it's a moving target in some ways, because its definition kind of changes from its original ancient Greek meaning. But from what I understand, it overlaps with indifference. I know Kathleen Norris has this book that I came across called Acedia and Me, and it describes it less as boredom or laziness and more as a depression, a state of unrest, a refusal to live in the present, or anxiety about the future as unbearably overwhelming. But I think where it differs from Francis's primary concern in indifference is that what Francis is talking about as the globalization of indifference is where becoming indifferent because of too many distractions, whereas what Norris is arguing is that acedia has to do more so with not having any distractions, or specifically anything that's long and perhaps unrewarding. I know she cites life in monasteries and perhaps long-term marriages, which is depressing on its own, as cases in which acedia could arise. But it seems like it's that you don't care about anything. So it's kind of an intense version of the indifference that Francis mentions, in the sense that you're not just distracted and unconcerned with other human beings, you're bored with God. So that's a good point that you make. I think it's a whole other paper, which perhaps I can present at another conference, but I wonder if it's a matter of indifference so pervasive that it's become the spiritual effect or whatever of something that's going on in the person's psyche, that they've repressed so much that it's taken over. The spiritual.
Really helpful. Thanks.
Great. Brian, did you want to comment on this as well? Or have another question?
It just got sparked by that. Thank you very much, Hannah, for the really interesting paper. I'm teaching actually at the very, very end of this semester stuff about Francis and the encounter, or culture of encounter, and I had sort of put it on, I have to confess, put it on the end of my syllabus because I knew I wanted to get there and I hadn't really figured out how I was going to integrate it yet. So this is very helpful in that regard. Michael's question and your response to it sort of sparked something interesting that I hadn't thought about until just now, where I wonder if you could speak to, as related to that discussion of acedia and indifference, the profound overwhelm that I'm feeling quite intensely in 2020, and I think a lot of other people are, because not only have we been given a billion different distractions to keep us sort of occupied with shiny things and avoiding what's actually important and encounter with others, but we're being inundated with just ungodly depressing information constantly. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about how sort of the culture of encounter resonates with that, because it seems, I can't quite put into words how, but it seems intimately connected with what both you and Michael were talking about.
Yeah, I know a lot of his homilies since COVID has started have continued, or at least increased his concern for indifference and for advocating the culture of encounter. I know right around Easter, he was emphasizing how important it is, even, and especially during these times, to make sure that our friends and our families know how loved they are. And I think he says, hold your families tight. But yeah.
Yeah, sorry, it wasn't a totally formed question, but I think that is a helpful way to think about it. Because it's.
Martin had asked a question in the chat that might be at least a little bit related to what Brian had just asked.
Sure.
Martin, do you want to either comment on what was just discussed or ask your question?
Oh, yeah. Good evening evening here. Thank you very much, Hannah. That was a very good talk. I just, the attitude of indifference, I think my question was simply, do you think there's an indifference due to the scale of the problem people feel they face? You know, there could be, it could be a case of, I think that's it. As Brian was just saying, that we're inundated with so much information, so many things coming to our way. People could just have this attitude of shutting down. I can't deal with it. I cannot affect change or cannot impact it in any way. So the safest thing is just to become as what's his name, Father Bishop Barron. Don't know if says come that sheltered self, it close into oneself. As that could be part of the problem. That's just based on my question. That's it. But thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. I mean, I know Francis mentions that the way media has changed our interactions has really contributed to the way that we filter out this horrible news on our own, and we have to kind of pick and choose what we give our full attention to. You know, the news comes on the TV, and we're given a series of horrible events, and you can't give enough time to each thing to acknowledge the event and its reality. But yeah, thank you for that.
I have something of a follow-up. Maybe that's also kind of, I'm wondering about what I see as like a potential limitation to Pope Francis's approach, in that, and even bringing in some of the Lonergan here, in that sometimes it sounds like he and Lonergan are saying kind of the same intersubjectivity, the same spontaneity that Lonergan talks about, like when someone's falling down the stairs and you reach to help them, that is what we need to renew for those across the globe and for these systematic issues, in order that we might get over the indifference that prevents us from doing the systematic things that are necessary. But I wonder if those are really the same. I mean, is the kind of encounter and love and spontaneous love that I have for an individual, whoever it is, in front of me or right around me, that I can do something directly for to assist, is that the same thing that we need to develop in order to do these sacrificial acts that, even if we just think about the environment, that quite frankly, there's not a clear individual who I'm doing this for, and there's not a clear way in which I see the effects of my actions. It almost seems to me there's a more intellectual part that needs to say, look, I recognize intellectually this needs to happen, even if I don't feel like, gosh, I'm really doing like this recycling or this, you know, whatever is really helping this individual person. So I don't know if you could comment on if there might be a different kind of overcoming of indifference that needs to happen when we think about big systematic or systemic issues.
Well, I think that might have to do with the role of the sensitive psyche supplying the desire to know with a personal concern in an image that gives it a sense of urgency. Like we need to care for our planet now because of, I don't know, the love you have for your niece, your nephew, that brings close how important the future of our planet is. Does that maybe get at your question?
Yeah, yeah, that sounds right. I'm just wondering if there's another step after that then too, right? So there's got to be something to spark that, but then is there, since in some cases you can immediately do something to help this person, but what is it that promotes that long-term and long-term sense? But I think that makes a lot of sense, that somehow connecting the large issue with something more specific and personal to you in order to give it the urgency that it deserves, even if overall it's overwhelming. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's a good question about long term. I'll have to think about that one.
Sure. Maybe time for one more. Liam, did you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thanks for your paper, Hannah. Just a lot of what you had said about Francis, and Pat mentioned it too in the chat about him, how like even like through his facial expressions, his action, his movement, his genuine joy, love, and compassion, you can see within him a sort of his own Christological self-fashioning that's going on, and in ironically a very Franciscan way. This, I think, has served as a catalyst for psychic conversion for a bunch of people. And I was just wondering if maybe you could comment on that, and perhaps comment on maybe with what you were saying and bringing it up, how that could potentially change our approach to the functional specialty of communications moving forward.
I mean, can you say more about what you mean by changing our approach to communications?
I mean, just sure. Changing our approach to communications in as much as we focus almost as much on the person as we do the message with someone like Pope Francis.
Well, I think he does a good job with explaining the role of communications, or modeling the role of communications. I'm not sure how explicit, I'm not sure how intentional he is about giving us an image. Actually, I take that back. I think he very intentionally gives us images and gestures in his homilies for just that purpose, for elaborating the message that he's speaking about, and for appealing to our emotions.
Great. Thank you, Hannah. Thanks all for asking questions. Great paper, great discussion.